a teenage girl wore the English crown for just 9 days before being locked in the Tower of London, her life cut short by an executioner's axe. One of medieval Europe's most formidable queens, a ruler for decades, was accused of unspeakable crimes and then, in her old age, suffered a horrific public execution, reportedly dragged to her death by a wild horse. Another queen, famed for her beauty and spirit, navigated treacherous court politics only to be beheaded on charges of treason, her downfall swift and shocking. And a powerful countess, heiress to vast lands, found herself stripped of everything, titles, territories, and wealth, after a series of disastrous choices and betrayals. These aren't fairy tales. They are the chilling realities faced by some of the most powerful noblewomen of the medieval era. Their climbs to power were often astonishing, but their falls were deeply, unforgettably tragic. Number 8. Lady Jane Grey. The 9-day queen who paid the ultimate price for a crown. She never sought. Imagine being 17, highly intelligent, and devoutly religious, only to be thrust onto the throne of England against your own deep misgivings. This was the reality for Lady Jane Grey in the summer of 1553. Jane was a great niece of King Henry VIII, placing her in the line of succession, though not directly. She was known for her Protestant faith and her formidable education, fluent in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. She preferred her books to the glittering, dangerous world of court politics. Her path to the throne was paved by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, an incredibly ambitious man who was chief minister to the young ailing King Edward VI. Edward, a staunch Protestant like Jane, was dying of tuberculosis. He, or perhaps more accurately Dudley, became desperate to prevent his Catholic half-sister, Mary Tudor, from inheriting the crown. Dudley, whose son Guildford was conveniently married to Jane just weeks before, persuaded Edward to alter the succession. In a document called the Devise for the Succession, Edward named Jane and her male heirs as his successors, bypassing both Mary and his other half-sister, Elizabeth. When King Edward VI died on July 6, 1553, Jane was reportedly horrified to learn she was to be queen. Accounts say she fainted or wept, arguing Mary's rightful claim. But Dudley and other Protestant nobles pressed her, and on July 10th, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen of England. She moved into the Tower of London, as was traditional for monarchs before their coronation. Her husband, Guildford Dudley, demanded to be made king, a request Jane refused, offering only to make him a duke. But the English people largely supported Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's elder daughter, as the rightful heir. Mary, who had been biding her time in East Anglia, declared herself queen and began to rally support. Nobles and commoners flocked to her cause. Dudley marched out with an army to confront Mary, but his support melted away. The Privy Council in London, seeing the tide, switched allegiance. On July 19, 1553, only 9 days after Jane's proclamation, the council declared Mary Tudor queen. Jane's brief, unwilling reign was over. She was still in the Tower of London, but now as a prisoner, not a queen. Her father-in-law, John Dudley, was executed for treason soon after. Jane and her husband Guildford were also tried for treason in November 1553 and found guilty. The death sentence hung over them. Queen Mary I was initially reluctant to execute her young cousin. Jane was, after all, a pawn in a larger game. However, fate intervened cruelly. In early 1554, a Protestant uprising known as Wyatt's Rebellion broke out, partly in opposition to Mary's plan to marry Philip of Spain. Although Jane had no involvement in the rebellion, her father, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, foolishly joined it. This sealed Jane's fate. The rebellion convinced Mary and her counselors that Jane, as a Protestant figurehead, would always be a focus for dissent as long as she lived. On February 12, 1554, Guildford Dudley was taken from the Tower and beheaded on Tower Hill. Jane, watching from her window, reportedly saw his body being brought back. A short while later, she herself was led to a private execution within the Tower grounds on Tower Green, a concession to her royal blood. She met her end with a courage and dignity that impressed eyewitnesses, proclaiming her Protestant faith and asking the executioner to dispatch her quickly. She was just 17 or 18 years old. Her tragic story became a symbol of innocence caught in the brutal power struggles of the Tudor court. Number 7. Catherine Howard. The teen queen, whose past undid her future. When Catherine Howard caught the eye of King Henry VIII in 1540, she was a young, vivacious teenager, a lady-in-waiting to Henry's recently discarded fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. Henry, then nearly 50, overweight and plagued by a painful leg ulcer, was instantly smitten by Catherine's youth and high spirits. He called her his rose without a thorn. Within weeks of annulling his marriage to Anne of Cleves, Henry married Catherine in July 1540, making her his fifth queen. She was perhaps 19 years old. Catherine came from the powerful Howard family. She was a niece of Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, and a first cousin to Anne Boleyn, Henry's executed second wife. Unlike Anne Boleyn, Catherine was not known for her intellect or strong religious views. She was, by all accounts, a lively girl who enjoyed music, dancing, and the attention of the king. Henry doted on her, showering her with jewels and affection. For a brief period, it seemed the aging king had found happiness. But Catherine had a past one that was not uncommon for young women in noble households at the time, but devastatingly dangerous for a queen of England married to a notoriously jealous and ruthless king. Before she came to court, while living in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, Catherine had been involved in romantic dalliances. She had an informal understanding, possibly a pre-contract of marriage, with Francis Dereham. She also had a music teacher, Henry Mannix, with whom she had engaged in some form of physical intimacy. These relationships, if known, could have invalidated her marriage to the king. The problem was that people from her past knew, and some of them, including Dereham and another man from her Norfolk days, Thomas Culpeper, a favorite gentleman of the king's privy chamber, were given positions in her royal household, likely through her own influence or that of her family. This was a catastrophically poor decision. In the autumn of 1541, while the king and queen were on a royal progress to the north of England, whispers of Catherine's past indiscretions reached Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. John Lascelles, whose sister Mary had been a servant in the Dowager Duchess's household with Catherine, revealed what he knew. Cranmer, initially hesitant, eventually presented the allegations to the king upon his return. Henry at first refused to believe them. However, an investigation was launched. Francis Derham was arrested, and under duress or torture confessed to his prior relationship with Catherine. He also implicated Thomas Culpeper, suggesting Culpeper had started an affair with Catherine after she became queen. Letters were found, one allegedly from Catherine to Culpeper, which seemed to confirm a close, affectionate relationship. Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, widow of Anne Boleyn's executed brother, who was one of Catherine's closest attendants, was also implicated in facilitating meetings between Catherine and Culpeper. The evidence, whether entirely true, coerced, or exaggerated, was enough for Henry. His rose without a thorn had, in his eyes, betrayed him. He fell into a deep depression and rage. Catherine was stripped of her title as queen in November 1541 and confined to Sion Abbey. Parliament passed an Act of Attainder in January 1542, declaring her guilty of treason without the need for a full trial. Her alleged premarital affairs were now deemed treasonous because she had not disclosed them before marrying the king. Her alleged affair with Culpeper was straightforward adultery, which for a queen was always treason. On February 13, 1542, less than 2 years after her grand wedding, Catherine Howard was taken to the Tower of London and executed on Tower Green, the same spot where Anne Boleyn had died. She was probably around 21 years old. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham had already been executed in December 1541. Lady Rochford was executed alongside Catherine. Catherine's downfall was swift and brutal, a stark warning of the perilous position of a queen whose past could be weaponized in the deadly game of Tudor court politics. Number 6. Anne Boleyn. The queen who changed England but couldn't save herself. Anne Boleyn was no ordinary noblewoman. Intelligent, ambitious, and possessing a captivating, if unconventional charm, she refused to be merely a king's mistress. When King Henry VIII fell passionately in love with her around 1526, she held out for marriage, a decision that would inadvertently trigger the English Reformation. Henry was already married to Catherine of Aragon, who had failed to provide him with a male heir. Anne's insistence on becoming queen, and Henry's obsession with her and his need for a legitimate son, led him to break with the Roman Catholic Church, declare himself supreme head of the Church of England, and annul his marriage to Catherine. Anne was crowned Queen of England in June 1533, already pregnant. In September, she gave birth, not to the longed-for son, but to a daughter, Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth I. This was a disappointment, but Henry and Anne remained hopeful. Anne was a queen of considerable influence. She was a patron of reformers and scholars, and her sophisticated French education shaped court culture. She was known for her style, her wit, and her strong will. However, her position was precarious. She had powerful enemies at court, particularly those who remained loyal to Catherine of Aragon and the Catholic Church. Her forthright manner and perceived arrogance also alienated some. The key to her survival, as it was for any queen of Henry VIII, was to produce a male heir. Subsequent pregnancies ended in miscarriages, including a male child in January 1536. This last loss, occurring around the time Henry suffered a serious jousting accident, seems to have been a turning point. By early 1536, Henry's ardor for Anne had cooled considerably. His eye had already fallen on Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, who presented a stark contrast to Anne, demure, gentle, and seemingly compliant. Anne's enemies, led by Thomas Cromwell, who had once been her ally but now saw her as a political liability, began to conspire against her. The downfall, when it came, was shockingly swift. In late April and early May 1536, several men from Anne's circle, including her own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, and a musician named Mark Smeaton, were arrested on charges of adultery with the Queen. Anne herself was arrested on May 2nd and taken to the Tower of London, entering through the Traitor's Gate. The charges were sensational and, to many historians, highly improbable. She was accused of multiple adulterous affairs, and most shockingly, of incest with her brother George. She was also accused of conspiring to kill the king and even of witchcraft. Mark Smeaton, a commoner, confessed under torture. The other men, all aristocrats, denied the charges of adultery, though Norris admitted to some inappropriate conversation. Anne and her brother were tried separately on May 15, 1536. Despite Anne's eloquent and spirited defense, they were found guilty of treason by a jury of their peers, which included her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. The evidence was flimsy, relying heavily on Smeaton's coerced confession and hearsay. Many believe the charges were fabricated to allow Henry to remove Anne and marry Jane Seymour. Before her execution, her marriage to Henry was annulled, conveniently declaring their daughter Elizabeth illegitimate. This move was likely to ensure that any children Henry had with Jane Seymour would have an undisputed claim to the throne. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded on Tower Green by a skilled swordsman brought specially from France, a supposed act of mercy from the king, as a sword was considered a more dignified and quicker death than the common axe. She faced her end with composure and courage, maintaining her innocence but also speaking respectfully of the king. Less than 2 weeks after Anne's execution, Henry VIII married Jane Seymour. Anne's dramatic rise and fall left an indelible mark on English history. A queen who reshaped a nation's faith but ultimately succumbed to the lethal politics of her husband's court. Number 5. Isabella of France. The she-wolf who toppled a king but lost her grip on power. Isabella, daughter of the powerful King Philip IV of France, arrived in England in 1308 as a beautiful young bride, around 12 years old, to marry King Edward II. Her marriage was intended to seal peace between England and France. Edward II, however, was already deeply attached to his favorite, Piers Gaveston. Isabella found herself neglected and humiliated as her husband showered Gaveston with lands, titles, and affection, often at her expense and that of the English nobility. Despite the rocky start and Edward's continued reliance on male favorites, after Gaveston's execution by disgruntled barons, Hugh Despencer, the younger, rose to prominence. Isabella fulfilled her dynastic duty, bearing Edward 4 children, including the future Edward III. For many years, she endured her husband's misrule and the Despensers' increasing power and greed, which alienated much of the kingdom. Isabella undertook diplomatic missions for Edward and was, for a time, a loyal wife. The turning point came in the 1320s. Relations between England and France soured, and Isabella's French lands were confiscated by Edward. In 1325, she was sent to France to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, King Charles IV. Once there, she refused to return to England as long as the Despensers held power. She had found an ally, and soon a lover, in Roger Mortimer, an exiled English baron who had escaped from the Tower of London and was a bitter enemy of Edward II and the Despensers. In France, Isabella became the figurehead for the growing opposition to Edward II. She gathered a small army of mercenaries, and in September 1326, along with Mortimer and her eldest son, Prince Edward, she invaded England. Her campaign was remarkably successful. The English people, weary of Edward II's reign and the Despensers' tyranny, largely supported her. Hugh Despenser, the younger, and his father were captured and brutally executed. King Edward II himself was captured in November 1326. In January 1327, Edward II was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, who became King Edward III. As Edward III was only 14, Isabella and Roger Mortimer ruled as regents. Edward II was imprisoned and died in Berkeley Castle in September 1327, under circumstances that remain mysterious and controversial. Many believed he was murdered on Isabella and Mortimer's orders. For about 3 years, Isabella, often dubbed the She-Wolf of France, and Mortimer wielded immense power. They accumulated vast wealth and estates, and Mortimer behaved with increasing arrogance, making enemies among the nobility. However, their grip on power was not secure. The young King Edward III chafed under their control. He resented Mortimer's influence over his mother and the realm, as well as the suspicious death of his father. In October 1330, just before his 18th birthday, Edward III staged a coup. With a small group of loyal companions, he entered Nottingham Castle through a secret tunnel, surprised Mortimer and Isabella, and arrested Mortimer. Roger Mortimer was swiftly tried for treason, including assuming royal power and complicity in Edward II's death, and was executed by hanging at Tyburn in November 1330. Isabella's fate was less brutal, but marked a definitive downfall from power. She was initially held under house arrest. Her lands were temporarily confiscated, but much of her property and income were later restored. She was never charged with any crime likely due to her status as the king's mother. For the rest of her life, Isabella lived in comfortable retirement, primarily at Castle Rising in Norfolk. While she was treated with respect by her son and occasionally appeared at court, her political influence was gone. She devoted herself to religious pursuits and died in 1358, nearly 30 years after her dramatic fall from grace. She had been a queen, a rebel, a ruler, and then for the remainder of her days a dowager queen stripped of all authority. Number 4. Jacqueline, Countess of Hainaut. The heiress who lost 4 husbands in a vast inheritance. Jacqueline of Bavaria, born in 1401, was one of the greatest heiresses of her time. At 16, upon the death of her father, William II, Duke of Bavaria-Straubing, she inherited the counties of Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland in the Low Countries, as well as titular claims in Bavaria. Her life, however, became a tumultuous saga of marriages, political strife, and ultimately the loss of her entire inheritance. Her first marriage, at age 14 in 1415, was to John Dauphin of France, son of King Charles VI. This union promised a future as Queen of France, but John died less than 2 years later in 1417, possibly from illness or poisoning. Jacqueline, widowed at 16, was still a highly desirable match due to her lands. Her uncle, John of Bavaria, Bishop of Liege, disputed her inheritance, claiming the territories for himself. This sparked a civil war. To strengthen her position, Jacqueline married again in 1418, this time to her cousin John IV, Duke of Brabant. This marriage was a disaster. John of Brabant was described as weak and ineffectual. He mortgaged parts of her territories to her uncle John of Bavaria and proved incapable of defending her rights. Jacqueline felt betrayed and politically undermined. In 1420, claiming her marriage to John of Brabant was invalid due to consanguinity. They were too closely related, and unhappy with his leadership, Jacqueline fled to England. There she sought the support of King Henry V. After Henry V's death in 1422, she caught the attention of his brother Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, who was regent for the infant King Henry VI. Jacqueline, still technically married to John of Brabant, controversially married Humphrey in 1423. This marriage was politically explosive. Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, a powerful cousin of John of Brabant and a rising force in the Low Countries, saw Gloucester's involvement as a direct threat to his own ambitions in the region. Jacqueline and Humphrey invaded Hainaut in 1424 to reclaim her lands. However, the venture was ill-fated. John of Brabant, backed by Philip of Burgundy, resisted. Pope Martin V eventually declared Jacqueline's marriage to Humphrey invalid in 1428, confirming her marriage to John of Brabant was legitimate. By this time, John of Brabant had died in 1427, but the papal ruling meant Jacqueline had no legal claim on Humphrey as a husband. Gloucester, perhaps seeing the political tide turn against him, and with his eye on other prospects, largely abandoned Jacqueline's cause and eventually had their marriage annulled to pursue another match. Jacqueline found herself increasingly isolated. Philip the Good of Burgundy systematically consolidated his power over her territories. She fought on, but her resources dwindled. In 1428, she was forced to sign the Treaty of Delft, also known as the Reconciliation of Delft. By this treaty, she recognized Philip the Good as her heir and regent of her lands. She was also forbidden to marry again without his consent. She was effectively stripped of her power, becoming a countess in name only. In 1432, Jacqueline secretly married a local nobleman from Zeeland, Frank van Borsele. When Philip the Good discovered this unsanctioned marriage, he imprisoned Borsele. To secure his release, Jacqueline was compelled to sign another treaty in 1433, ceding all her remaining rights to Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland to Philip of Burgundy. Frank van Borsele was released and given the title Count of Oosterwend. Jacqueline retired from public life with Frank, living on estates granted to her in Zeeland. She died of tuberculosis in 1436, at the age of just 35. She had inherited a vast domain, been married 4 times in attempts to secure her power and find happiness, and engaged in years of political and military struggle. In the end, she lost it all to the relentless ambition of Philip the Good. Her life a poignant example of a great heiress, overwhelmed by the complex dynastic and political forces of 15th century Europe. Number 3. Margaret of Anjou. The Queen, who fought relentlessly and lost everything. Margaret of Anjou, a French princess, niece of King Charles VII of France, was married to King Henry VI of England in 1445. She was 15. He was 23. The marriage was part of a peace treaty intended to end the 100 Years' War, but it was unpopular in England as it involved ceding the English territory of Maine to France. Margaret was beautiful, intelligent, and strong-willed, qualities that would become crucial as her husband's reign unraveled. King Henry VI suffered from periods of severe mental illness, rendering him incapable of ruling. During these episodes, and increasingly even when he was lucid, Margaret stepped into the power vacuum. She fiercely protected her husband's crown and, after the birth of their son Edward of Westminster in 1453, she became a relentless defender of her son's right to the throne. This thrust her into the heart of the brutal dynastic conflict known as the Wars of the Roses, fought between the House of Lancaster, Henry VI's house, and the House of York, led by Richard, Duke of York, who also had a claim to the throne. Margaret became the de facto leader of the Lancastrian faction. She was a formidable political operator and a determined military strategist, raising armies and personally leading her forces on occasion. Her enemies portrayed her as a vindictive and cruel she-wolf, a Frenchwoman meddling destructively in English affairs. Her supporters saw her as a courageous queen fighting for her family's survival. The tide of the Wars of the Roses ebbed and flowed. Margaret experienced both stunning victories and devastating defeats. After the Lancastrians were defeated at the Battle of Northampton in 1460 and Henry VI was captured, Margaret fled with her son. She rallied support in the north and achieved a major victory at the Battle of Wakefield in December 1460, where Richard, Duke of York, was killed. His head, along with those of his son Edmund and the Earl of Salisbury, was displayed on the gates of York, allegedly crowned with a paper crown by Margaret's order. She won another victory at the Second Battle of St. Albans in early 1461, freeing her husband. However, she failed to take London. Edward, Earl of March, Richard of York's eldest son, then decisively defeated the Lancastrians at the Battle of Towton in March 1461, a horrifically bloody engagement. Edward of March was crowned King Edward IV. Margaret, Henry VI, and their son Edward fled to Scotland and then to France, where they lived in exile for several years. Margaret never gave up. She tirelessly sought support from European rulers, eventually forging an unlikely alliance with Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, who had previously been her enemy, but had fallen out with Edward IV. In 1470, Warwick invaded England, restored Henry VI to the throne briefly, and forced Edward IV into exile. Margaret and her son prepared to return to England. But their triumph was short-lived. Edward IV returned in 1471. Margaret and her son landed in England on the very day Warwick was defeated and killed at the Battle of Barnet. Just a few weeks later, on May 4, 1471, Margaret's Lancastrian forces were crushed at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Her beloved son, Edward of Westminster, then 17 or 18 years old, was killed either in the battle or executed shortly afterward. This was the ultimate tragedy for Margaret. The son whose rights she had fought for so fiercely was gone. Margaret herself was captured. Her husband, Henry VI, already a prisoner in the Tower of London, was murdered days later, likely on Edward IV's orders to extinguish the Lancastrian line. Margaret remained a prisoner in England for several years, first at Wallingford Castle and then in the Tower. In 1475, King Louis XI of France, her cousin, ransomed her. She returned to France, ceding her rights to her French inheritance to Louis in exchange. She spent the last years of her life in relative poverty and obscurity in Anjou, a broken woman who had lost her crown, her husband, her son, and her cause. She died in 1482, around the age of 52. Her life was one of relentless struggle marked by profound personal loss and the brutal realities of dynastic warfare. Number 2. Joanna I of Naples, the cultured queen entangled in murder, intrigue, and a violent end. Joanna I became Queen of Naples, Countess of Provence and Forcalquier, and titular Queen of Jerusalem and Sicily at the age of 16 or 17 in 1343. Upon the death of her grandfather, King Robert the Wise, Robert had designated her as his heir, stipulating that she marry her cousin Andrew, a prince of the Hungarian branch of their Angevin dynasty. The marriage was intended to unite the two branches, but it was deeply unhappy. Andrew was ambitious and sought to rule as king in his own right, not just as Joanna's consort, a move supported by his powerful Hungarian relatives and the Pope. Joanna, on the other hand, was a cultured and assertive young woman, raised in a sophisticated Neapolitan court. She was determined to rule in her own name. The court was rife with factions supporting either Joanna or Andrew. In September 1345, just 2 years into her reign, Andrew was brutally murdered at Avarsa. He was attacked, strangled, and thrown from a balcony. Some accounts even claimed he was sewn into a mattress. Suspicion immediately fell on Joanna and her close circle, including some of her cousins and courtiers. While her direct involvement was never definitively proven, and she was later acquitted in a papal court, the scandal tainted her reign and provided a pretext for her enemies. Louis I of Hungary, Andrew's elder brother, accused Joanna of the murder and launched military invasions of Naples to avenge his brother and claim the kingdom for himself. Joanna was forced to flee Naples multiple times, taking refuge in Provence. Her life became a whirlwind of political maneuvering warfare and strategic marriages. After Andrew's death, she married 3 more times. Her second husband was Louis of Taranto, another cousin, with whom she fought to regain her kingdom. After his death, she married James IV, titular King of Majorca, and finally Otto, Duke of Brunswick-Reubenhagen. These marriages were largely political, aimed at securing allies and stability, but none brought lasting peace. Despite the constant turmoil, Joanna was a patron of arts and letters. Her court was known for its culture, and she maintained a degree of stability in her Provençal territories. She also found herself embroiled in the complexities of the Western Schism, which began in 1378 when 2 and later 3 rival popes claimed legitimacy. Joanna initially supported Pope Urban VI in Rome, but their relationship soured. Urban VI excommunicated her and declared her deposed, offering her kingdom to her cousin and adopted heir, Charles of Durazzo. Joanna then switched her allegiance to the Avignon Pope, Clement VII. This decision proved fatal. Charles of Durazzo, with papal backing from Urban VI and Hungarian support, invaded Naples in 1381. Joanna's forces were defeated, and her husband, Otto of Brunswick, was captured. Joanna herself was besieged in Castelnuovo in Naples and eventually forced to surrender in August 1381. Charles of Durazzo had her imprisoned. Joanna hoped for release, perhaps through the intervention of Clement VII or Louis I of Anjou. A different Louis, brother of the French king, whom she had named as her new heir, after falling out with Charles of Durazzo. But Charles of Durazzo, now King Charles III of Naples, saw her as a continued threat. In May 1382, after nearly a year of captivity, Joanna I was murdered in the castle of Muro Lucano. The exact method is uncertain, but it is widely believed she was either strangled or smothered with pillows, an echo of her first husband's violent death. She was around 55 or 56 years old. Her long and turbulent reign, marked by early scandal and constant power struggles, ended in a brutal act of political expediency. Number 1. Brunhilde of Austrasia. The Visigothic queen who ruled for decades before a horrific execution. Brunhilde was a Visigothic princess from Spain, born around 543. In 567, she married Sigebert I, the Merovingian king of Austrasia, one of the Frankish kingdoms. Her sister, Galswintha, married Sigebert's half-brother, Chilperic I, king of Neustria. This double alliance was meant to bring peace, but it ignited one of the longest and bloodiest feuds in Merovingian history. Chilperic allegedly, at the instigation of his low-born mistress and later wife, Fredegund, had Galswintha murdered. This act sparked an intense, lifelong animosity between Brunhilde and Fredegund. Brunhilde was a remarkable woman for her time. She was well educated, intelligent, and possessed a formidable will. When her husband Sigebert I was assassinated in 575, likely on Fredegund's orders, Brunhilde found herself a widow in a hostile kingdom. She was briefly imprisoned, but managed to escape and secure the Austrasian throne for her 5-year-old son, Childebert II. For much of the next 4 decades, Brunhilde would be the dominant power in Austrasia, and at times in Burgundy, which Childebert later inherited. She ruled as regent for her son, then for her grandsons, Theudebert II, Austrasia, and Theuderic II, Burgundy after Childebert's death, and finally, briefly, for her great-grandson Sigebert II. Brunhilde was an able administrator. She repaired old Roman roads, built churches and abbeys, reformed royal finances, and attempted to strengthen the monarchy against the powerful Frankish aristocracy. She corresponded with Pope Gregory the Great and was praised by him for her piety and good governance, at least in the earlier parts of her career. However, her efforts to centralize power and her foreign Visigothic origins often put her in conflict with the Austrasian nobles, who resented her authority and what they saw as her autocratic style. She was also relentless in pursuing her feud against Fredegund and Fredegund's son, Clothar, II of Neustria. As she aged, her methods became, or were portrayed by her enemies as, increasingly ruthless. She was accused of ordering the deaths of numerous opponents, including Saint Didier of Vienne. She fell out with her grandson, Theudebert II of Austrasia, who eventually expelled her. She then allied with her other grandson, Theuderic II of Burgundy, and together they defeated and killed Theudebert. When Theuderic II died young in 613, Brunhilde attempted to rule once more as regent for his young son, her great-grandson Sigebert II. By this point, Brunhilde was nearly 70 years old. The Austrasian and Burgundian nobility, led by figures like Pepin of Landen and Arnulf of Metz, ancestors of the Carolingian dynasty, were weary of her long rule and her ongoing wars. They betrayed her and her great-grandsons, delivering them into the hands of her lifelong enemy, Clothar II of Neustria, son of Fredegund. Clothar II, now effectively king of all the Franks, subjected Brunhilde to a show trial. He accused her of a litany of crimes, most notably of being responsible for the deaths of 10 Frankish kings, a propagandistic exaggeration, though she had certainly been involved in the deaths of several political rivals and family members through decades of conflict. According to the Chronicle of Fredegar, a primary source for this period, the one hostile to Brunhilde, she was tortured for 3 days. Then, in a final act of extreme brutality, the elderly queen was paraded on a camel for the army to mock, and finally tied by her hair, one arm and one leg to the tail of a wild, untamed horse. The horse was set loose, and Brunhilde was dragged and trampled to death. This horrific execution in 613 brought a gruesome end to the life of one of the most powerful and long-reigning women of the early medieval period, a queen whose fierce determination to rule ultimately led to an unimaginably tragic downfall